I hate to have to bring it up. But Australia is no stranger to me. I know your country very well. Before the Yanks came, I was senior officer president of Northern Australia. Not because I had any rank, but because there wasn't anybody else there. Perhaps you're aware of the status of a senior officer president naval status. That's the flag ashore. Senior officer president ashore commands all senior officer presidents afloat. It's one of these interesting things. Well, I got mixed up in the early part of the war and got detoured and that sort of thing, and I finally wound up falling back to Brisbane. And I was walking down the street in a bad state of dishabille. I'd saved some insignia, you know. And the Army stopped me, said, "Who are you?" And I gave my name, rank, and serial number. They said, "Do you realize that there's no naval officer in this port or in Northern Australia?" And I said, well, I hadn't realized it. Couldn't have cared less, as a matter of fact. I was thinking, gosh, it's nice to be alive. And, well, now, in your regulations, the Army said, I'm sure you will find a clause that says, by exigencies of service on foreign station, the senior naval officer present shall take command of all naval activities. So I looked at my stripes. I said, okay, that's the way it is. I'll sit around and look pretty. Look pretty. There's 17 merchantmen in Brisbane Lower River. They haven't been brought in. There's $4 million worth of jettison cargo laying on the docks that nobody has any responsibility for. There are 250 refugees who have just dropped back from Malaysia and Singapore that nobody's taking any responsibility for. And you have about 200 naval personnel drifting through this port that nobody's taking any responsibility for. There are enemy agents all over the place. Nobody's taking charge of naval censorship. Well, here's a sergeant and a girl, and there's your office. For ensuing months, I had a ball. Forgot what it was like to sleep. I remember vividly, you see, Australia had already been written off the books by the U.S. Navy. I don't know if you knew that very early in the war. In the U.S. entrance into the war, it had been written off the books. I opened up the Trans-Pacific telephone line and called the Bureau of Naval Operations, Navy Department, Washington, D.C., because I'd sent them already 10 messages without any single reply. One of them had to do with what the hell did they want me to do with a heavy cruiser? So I just phoned them up clear. Straight through, got the officer of the day right in the Navy Department, in the Pentagon, in Washington, and I said, this is Hubbard, senior officer present in Northern Australia. I want to talk to somebody who will give me orders for certain vessels in these waters. And he said, just a moment. And I waited. And the Australian telephone company I was working with, they waited. Everybody waited. And the voice came back and said, "Well, I'm sorry, there's nobody of that name here." And hung up. Australia didn't exist. The ship in question was a heavy cruiser, and its four-striped captain had first come ashore and had looked at me, you know, what, your senior officer present, you know, and it sniffed. And I was trying to get him orders, and he was trying to get orders, and everybody was trying to do something to get it out of here because the Japanese might strike in the north at any time. He finally came in the office, you know, all four stripes and gold braid and so forth, and he said, "Mr. Hubbard," he said, if you will sign sailing orders for me, I'll sail." So I scribbled out, "You are hereby detached from this station and shall proceed upon your way as befits your duties and missions." Signed, L. Ron Hubbard. A couple of years later, I was kicking around. I had command of a squadron over on the other side of the war. I was kicking around an officers' club, and I had just been introduced to somebody, and this officer sat there, and all of a sudden he went into a brown study, you know. "Did you say your name is Hubbard?" Sorry. Hubbard. He says, "L.R. Hubbard." I said, "That's right." He says, "Good God," he says, "you're that fellow from down in Australia." And actually, through the remainder, they had kept this set of orders framed on the wall of this U.S. heavy cruiser for the remainder of the war. And actually, throughout the remainder of the war, I was known as that fellow who was in Australia. So you see, I must be one of you. Oh, very funny. Very funny. I sent 4 ships to MacArthur, and everybody said you mustn't send them. Refugees all over the place. Everybody says they're probably all spies. You mustn't do anything with them. I'd keep rounding them up and shoving them aboard ships, and people would say, "We can't take them. I have no orders." I'd say, "Yes, you have. You got my orders. Take them." I remember reading at that time, a U.S. newspaper story. It says, "Where is the U.S. fleet? Where is the U.S. fleet?" And there's a big picture, you see, of battleships and a map of Australia. "It is guarding the shores of Australia." The U.S. fleet was on the bottom at Pearl Harbor, thud. And what was guarding the shores of Australia was a 6-inch gun in charge of some Australian naval reservists down at the mouth of the Brisbane River, a few territorials with Lee Enfields, and Hubbard with a submachine gun. I was the anti-aircraft battery. Actually had bullets for the thing. That was before the Yanks came. It was very amusing. One of my officers, some years later, told somebody, yes, he's the fellow who was down in Australia. He was relieved by 1 million men. Well, we had a ball. One of the jobs I had was keeping enough rumors on the line. Every time we'd find a spy, why, naval intelligence and army intelligence and so forth, I've actually received orders. Take him out in the middle of the harbor and drown him. See, spy? Oh, no. No, I just tell him, well, now listen, I've got something for you to do, you see. I'd give him all the data on all the batteries. I'd tell him I was privately a German spy, you see. And I wanted him somehow or other to get the dope to the Japs. All the tremendous masked batteries and the airfields and the tremendous numbers of troops and the battleships and everything that were down here ready to knock the Japs off. Anything to keep the Japanese High Command totally convinced that there was something here. I'll never know, I'll just never know why Australia came through it at that time. I'll never know the facts. I finally figured out why the Allies won the war over the Japs. Because the Jap High Command was stupider than ours. And that's the only real reason for it. But Australia had shipped everything it had overseas at that time. There was nothing left in the country, and there was just a handful of troops and so forth here just to make some kind of a show. Any boatload of Jap Marines could have taken the country. That was up till almost the end of spring of 1942. Maybe you didn't even know it was in that condition, but it was really rough. It was something to perspire about quite heavily. I thought I was going to come back to Australia at the end of 42. They shipped me home and within a week gave me corvettes North Atlantic. And I went on fighting submarines in the North Atlantic and doing other things and so on. And I finally got a set of orders for the ship. By that time I had the squadron. And I got a set of orders. And these orders said, you will proceed through the Panama Canal to Auckland and then Melbourne. And I thought, isn't that nice? Now that the place is in good shape, everything, why, maybe I can go back because I think Australia is wonderful. I called all the officers together in the wardroom, and I said, well, here we go, and isn't this swell, and everything's fine, and this is all super secret, and you're not supposed to tell anybody but your girls. About 24 hours later, I myself got a set of orders. And it said, you are hereby detached as commander of the squadron, and you will proceed to the training center in Florida for preparation to take command of a new war vessel. Reason, you see, the reference was all nav something or other, which any officer who had served in these waters and area up to the beginning of summer of 1942 would not be returned to these waters for a year. Now, you tell me why. I don't know why. But that was the order they put out because there actually weren't many people got home from the Asiatic fleet. Maybe you noticed that there was a few casualties around. And so I got detached and I went to Florida, not Melbourne. This is the first time I've had a chance to be back.